Before Albert dies, he managed to gain assurances that the next time the papacy was vacant, Octavian would be elected. When he becomes pope, some records have him as young as 16, some as old as the middle 20s, but still fairly young to be leading a rather sizable religious body. It is this individual, John the 12th, who will crown Otto as the Holy Roman Emperor. Octavian, John the 12th, lived a totally unscrupulous life. There are records of him having drunken orgies. He had a harem. Some people from the time said that he lived the devil's life. Before going on a military campaign in 962, Otto, right, the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, warns him to change his weapons. Well, John tries to find allies that are going to help him defeat Otto. Remember, this is the man that he is crowned emperor. Otto discovers it. He decides to bring a council together, calls for John to appear. John refuses. Eventually, John is deposed. But when Otto leaves Rome, John returns with an army that causes then Pope Leo VIII to flee. So he kind of becomes ruler again. He gets himself reinstated. There are rumors that his enemies are found cut to pieces. Eventually, he will die during an adulterous encounter during it, but it's unclear exactly what happened. There are some rumors that said that he had an episode while engaged. Others say that the husband came home while he and this woman were engaged and killed him. Emperors deposed popes. They put in new popes in power. There's issues of trying to decide which pope is the actual pope. All these attempts to try and control the papacy. Then there's also the example of Benedict IX. Benedict IX was the son of Alberic III, making him the great-grandson of Marozia. He became pope 3 times in the 11th century, in the middle of the 11th century. He becomes pope around the age of 20 in the year 1032. There are some ancient sources that claim that he was as young as 11 or 12, but it seems like early adulthood is more likely. He too lived a scandalous life, had very, very few qualities or qualifications that would have suggested he should be pope, right? There's not much to say, oh, this is the leader we want. There are even rumors that he was homosexual, that he was a rapist, that he was a murderer, right? So none of the even rumors about him were anything possible.
So society wasn't really buying that whole pope infallibility thing anymore.
Yeah, that's not really something that's is recognized. He is forced out of the papacy in the year 1036, but appeals to the emperor, and the emperor helps him return to the papacy. He is forced out again in 1044. This time, a pope is elected to take his place. So that's the first time he's pope. This pope was Pope Sylvester III. He gains some support and returns in 1045 and takes over again. But he decides, well, maybe I want to do something different, right? So he's just kind of become pope again, and now he decides, I'm going to abdicate. Some sources claim that he wanted to get married, but it's, any of a variety of reasons. So he decides he's going to resign. So he essentially sells the papacy to his godfather, a man named John Gratian, who actually thinks Benedict is unworthy of being pope. Right? So he's kind of glad to, take over and get rid of this guy who shouldn't be pope to begin with. John Grayson becomes Gregory VI just a few months after Benedict had returned. Not surprisingly, word kind of gets out that this is the way he's come to the papacy, and so he's accused of simony, which he admits that he paid money for all of this, but he doesn't see it as simony because it was basically to get rid of Benedict. Right? And so it had a positive goal, is what's here. Well, Benedict kind of decides, maybe I shouldn't have resigned. And so he came back and decides, maybe I should have come back. Then he resigns, decides maybe he shouldn't have resigned. And so he comes back, takes the city of Rome. Gregory, of course, still claims to be the rightful pope. In the midst of all this, Sylvester, who had kind of gone back to being the bishop of where he had been before he was elected pope, decides, you know what? Maybe I should be pope. All right, so now you have Benedict claiming he should be pope, Gregory claiming he should be pope, and now Sylvester again claiming he should be pope. Henry III, the emperor, gets involved, and so he deposes Benedict and Sylvester, kicks them out. You're no longer pope. The bishops encourage Gregory to resign because of the simony issue. And so Clement II is elected as pope. When Clement dies, Benedict seizes the papacy again in 1047. So he's now been pope 3 times. Now, those last few haven't been so much about election as it's been about power. Eventually, though, he's driven out by German troops, and Dionysius II is elected. Ultimately, Benedict is excommunicated due to simony because he had sold the office to his godfather. Not, obviously, the kind of image you would think of as the Christian leader of the church, the worldwide church.
Do we know how much you sold it for?
I didn't see anything that would, I don't know what the going rate would be for papacy. My guess is it was probably, you could probably get a good amount of money for it.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Was anybody just shaking their heads, just like, what are we even going to be doing?
There probably was quite a bit of that. We'll see later on down the line something similar happen again, not so much from the immorality standard, but just the power control standard where you have rival popes. You have more than 2 right, at the same time claiming them to be pope. And so probably, for the common person who knows of this is probably just stunned as to what all is going on.
Was there one pope that was general, like by popular vote, as it were, one pope that the people really kind of wanted in place?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there was too much of that. Now, going back, the Catholic Church has listed, right, these are the legitimate popes during this reign, and these other ones are not. Gregory is considered to be a legitimate pope. Sylvester is considered to be a legitimate pope, and then Benedict is as well, just 3 different times. Clement, if I remember correctly, Clement II, who's in all of that, is considered to be an anti-pope. I don't believe he's considered to be an actual legitimate. Any other questions? Very, troubling, time, I'm sure, for the Catholic Church. But that's not the only thing we can say about the later Middle Ages. There were cases of individuals trying to bring some reform to this system that ended in abuses like this sometimes. And often those moments of reform came out of the monasteries. And it's the monks, the nuns, who are living that life that bring encouragement to try and make changes. Now, particularly, we're talking here about the western side of the empire, in the Western Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. And one major monastic reform came out of the monastery at Cluny in France. Essentially, there are some monks in this 11th century that are really disturbed that the Benedictine rule, which had been the rule for several hundred years, as we talked about in the last section, had largely been abandoned, which they believed had led towards the laxity among the monastic community, but then also some of the troubles that had been seen in the bishopric and the papacy, etc. And so various monks at various times sought to reestablish the Benedictine rule. One of those was the monastery at Cluny, and William of Aquitaine, rather important noble at the time, as Cluny is established, gives protection to this land that he had owned, that he gives to the monastery, and to protect it from outside interference by deeding the land to Peter and Paul. And so instead of deeding the land to like a bishop or an abbot or to the church, he kind of puts it out of their reach. So it's like these outside powers theoretically won't be able to mess with it. By 1100, there were 1,000 houses that followed the Cluniac example. Essentially, there were two different types of houses related to Cluny. There were those that we might call daughter houses that were established where their leadership was still the abbot of the monastery in Cluny. And so they didn't have a local abbot, they obeyed the abbot at the main monastery. Often they would have a prior who would be submissive to the abbot general, as he was called. The other type of monasteries were monasteries that weren't directly connected to Cluny, but followed their example. And so they're kind of associated monasteries, but not very closely tied. There are a couple of characteristics of these monasteries that were important parts of the reforms that they encouraged. First was they tended to be very independent from other types of power. Cluniac monasteries would elect their own abbot, whether that was the abbot general or whether it was one of these associated monasteries. They would be exempt from the bishop's oversight, exempt from taxes, and often had a lot of freedom from Roman control. Secondly, they also contributed to the development of the clergy because these were, previously a lot of monks lived the monastic life, but they weren't priests and bishops. Some were, but a lot weren't. But now, with the Cluniac monasteries, you have the development of monastics who are also priests and bishops. So they're living under a monastic rule, but they're also the people out there preaching and offering the sacraments, etc. Instead of the manual labor that was a part of other types of monasteries, a lot of the focus was on hiring servants or having serfs who would take care of the lands of the monastery, and the monks of Cluny would just kind of oversee that. That was basically so that they would have time to focus on praying, participating in the liturgy and worship, and engaging themselves in learning. The plan of the monastery was to focus on prayer and devote a lot of your time to prayer. In some cases, there are claims that they would recite up to 138 psalms in a single day. They would participate in things like, Bible reading, but it was predominantly what was known as Lectio Divina, which is a very slow, devotional approach to reading and meditation, not just a reading to get done with reading or a reading to find out specific information. Monks in Cluny were expected to engage in silence. They were not to be talking. Any communication was to be done through sign language. According to a scholar named Lowry Daly, Cluny demonstrated the spectacle of true monks detached, humble, chaste, and obedient, occupied in the continual service of God, by means of a highly developed type of liturgical worship. And so the idea was that we're going to commit ourselves totally to serving God.